Greetings to everybody. Good afternoon for those of you who are on our time zone, barely. Good morning for those who are to our west, and good evening for some who are coming in from Israel on our east, well to our east, and those in Europe where it's almost evening. I'm welcoming you on behalf of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning at Boston College. I'm Ruth Langer. I am interim director of the center. For a few more days, July 1st, we will be welcoming Daniel Jocelyn Simatovsky as our new director. With me today are Camille Markey, the center's associate director, and Sam Jai, who is one of my graduate students who will be helping us with the technological issues of running a Zoom meeting. This is not a webinar, so I do ask you to please keep yourselves muted until we get to the discussion section of the program. And please use the chat to send questions, and we will make them, don't send them directly just to Barbara, but send them to all of us so that we can organize the questions and give them to Barbara when we get to that. We're really glad that you have all joined us for what for us is a new endeavor, running a program which is outside of the university's academic calendar. But we thought, why not? People are interested, and indeed we have a strong interest in today's program. The talk is by Dr. Barbara Meyer of Tel Aviv University, where she is an associate professor in the religious studies program that is in its School of Philosophy. Barbara and I first met in Jerusalem. We just decided in 2009, and in the dining room of Deborah Weissman, who has joined us here. And since then, it's been, to me, a very special and important friendship and dialogic relationship. She was already then engaged in interreligious dialogue in the Israeli context, but we have since crossed paths in many corners of the world in the course of various dialogic projects. I think particularly of a lunch along the river in San Antonio a bunch of years ago. Indeed, Dr. Meyer is one of an even more elite group of systematic theologians who have devoted their careers to understanding the complex doctrinal implications for Christianity of the new Christian thinking about Jews and Judaism. And the book that she's going to be speaking about today is titled Jesus the Jew in Christian Memory, Theological and Philosophical Explorations. Was published by Cambridge University Press in 2020, and we will, in fact, I see Sam just shared a link in the chat for a discount coupon for the book. This book is very, very important in that it has spurred off a lot of questions and thinking in the greater dialogue community. It's asked a question that first occurred to me many years ago, just sort of wondering about it in casual ways, but Barbara's raised this question of what do we mean by Jesus the Jew to a level of sophistication that is generating new thoughts, new thinking, and new work in a lot of ways. In this book, she probes a series of different aspects of the implications for Christology that come when one holds front and center the Jewishness of Jesus, whether this is the historical Jesus in his own context, the Jesus as remembered by subsequent generations of Christians, the Jesus of Christian faith today, or the Jesus of the future, the eschatological Jesus whose return Christians expect. She asks what was important about Jesus's Jewishness in these various contexts, and how should this be shaping Christian faith, and even what are its implications for Jews? How does this affect the interrelationships between today's Christian and Jewish communities? So today, Dr. Meyer is going to address one subset of these questions and talk about the suffering Jewish Jesus and Christian memory. Again, I ask that you please be certain to stay muted during the formal presentation and even when other people are speaking during the discussion. And please submit discussion questions as they occur to you in the chat. I also recommend that you turn your Zoom to speaker view during the presentation itself. The button on the top right, if you're on a computer screen where it says view, gives you options. This event is being recorded, and we will post the video on our website and social media in about a week, we expect, and we'll email to all of those who are registered for today the video link so that you can share it with your friends and neighbors, and we have greater impact going forward. So with that, Barbara, it's for you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ruth. It's good to see you all. And thank you so much, Ruth, for this wonderful opportunity to talk about my book. It's great to see you all. Some students from Tel Aviv, they don't always look like students, so you will not easily find out who is one. People that I love meeting, and people that I always for a long time wanted to meet, like Kaiko Dritke Hesslein, who I've actually never met and seen. So that's really wonderful. Thank you for being here. I just told Ruth and Camille that I'm a little nervous, and they told me that the audience is usually friendly. Now that now that they are recording us, you all also have to behave really well. But I'm not so scared of being interrupted. I can either say I'm still speaking, or in Israel, that's the way to show that you're engaged. So I'm not worried about it. So Ruth suggested that rather talking about the whole book, we would focus on a certain aspect of the book, and then I chose the topic of suffering. That has to do with my cultural context, Tel Aviv, where in Tel Aviv, people tend to think, not everybody thinks, but tend to think that Christianity is basically identified with belief in redemptive suffering. And that's what people do over there in Jerusalem, far away, where they Christians are most of the time on their knees on the Via Dolorosa, which they are, but not always and not only. So let me start. My first sentence that relates to what Ruth said. The memory Jesus was a Jew is not a critical theory in itself. But the memory of Jesus Jewishness does have a critical potential. That's what I found for Christian theological thinking. So now I'd like to ask, can the memory of Jesus Jewishness facilitate a critical approach to suffering in Christian theology? And we'll talk a lot about why I find that important. More specifically, how can the memory of Jesus Jewishness help to shift our attention to the suffering person? That's my first example of the repair or the critical approach to suffering in Christian tradition that I find important. Now, sadly, this is all a pressing issue. There's so much suffering right now, and we obviously don't have answers. Most of you are in America. You hear this sending thoughts and prayers to parents after school shootings, and it has become almost a shift for apathy. It's going to be one of the key words here. Sending thoughts and prayers, but that actually means, you don't, nothing's happening. So not just the answers, even formulating the question, how can we change that, is a challenge here. And as Friedrich Wilhelm Marquardt stated, that the post-Shoah question, how did God allow that to happen, can be asked in German only, how did we allow that to happen? But that's just for Germans, and even Germans need to ask further questions. So the question for our conversation here is how the memory of the Jewish Jesus can help our approach to suffering. Help in the sense of not being apologetic, help in the sense of being helpful to the suffering person. Again, not by providing an answer, but by trying to ask the question in a way that is not apathetic about the actual pain of the suffering person or the remembering survivor. I will ask this as a Christological question, but in conversation that I chose with three thinkers who are not theologians. And I will build on the thesis, my thesis, that remembering Jesus as a Jew who suffered enables today's Christians to understand his suffering probably as the suffering of another. Now we're getting into this philosophical language that is, it is crucial for the post-Shoah philosophical discourse about suffering that we talk about the suffering of another. It is the suffering of the other, not my suffering, and also not everybody's general suffering. It's the suffering of the other that holds a central place in the philosophies of Emmanuel Levinas and Adi Ophir, two philosophers who were not concerned with Jesus in their thinking or writing or at all. But as we will see, and we can discuss it later, I find their thinking about suffering very helpful for a possible repair, a tikkun of the Christian approach to suffering. It is the suffering of the other that is not for us to interpret, as both philosophers state. Now let me share my screen. Okay, let's see how I do that. I begin my chapter about suffering, this the chapter after and against suffering in my book, with a big statement. It says, thinking about suffering has never been the same since Levinas' 1982 essay, Useless Suffering. It's important that this essay was published in 1982 in French. It means that this is a long time. It's not shortly after the Shoah, but it's a long time after Levinas' own experience in a camp for prisoners of war in Fallingbostel. I mention that because I find it, because Fallingbostel is a place near to the town I grew up in and was born, Hanover, very, very, very close in the Lüneburger Heide. And also after his latest magnum opus, Otherwise Than Being or Beyond a Sense. That is a book that was dedicated to the memory of the murdered survivors, but does not mention the Shoah as such. For Levinas, the biblical search for meaning in suffering cannot be continued after the Shoah. In his article, Useless Suffering, that was originally also a lecture, he says, the disproportion between suffering and every theodicy was shown at Auschwitz with a glaring and obvious clarity. Theodicy, it seems, means a lot more to Levinas than simply justifying God with regard to human suffering. And here's an even more complicated quote. That's why I'm using the PowerPoint here. Levinas speaks of the destruction of all balance between the explicit and the implicit theodicy of Western thought and the forms which suffering and its evil take in the very unfolding of this century. Complete destruction of the balance between any theodicy in Western thought and suffering and its evil. suffering is not discussed by itself. It is suffering and it's evil. We'll come back to that. Levinas does not address suffering as a reality in itself. It is connected to evil, tainted by evil. It would be inadequate to discuss suffering without mentioning the evil behind it. I agree with him. That's my thesis, is that Levinas says here something that has relevance not just for Jewish post-Shoah philosophers, but for Christians as well. In the 20th century, explanations and interpretations cannot catch up with the enormity of suffering. We may discuss later if this is specific to the 20th century or whether suffering has become theologically indefensible since. One might find meaning in one's own suffering. Levinas does not negate the possibility of this kind of self-reflection. Those of you who work in clinical counseling, pastoral counseling, know that very well and know also the difference. Suffering, as Levinas states, is meaningful in me, useless in the other. Levinas presents this view philosophically and not as part of any particular religious tradition. His assessment of this destruction of all balance between theodicy and suffering and its evil is not limited to a Jewish philosophical worldview. It is a statement that applies to everybody capable of remembering 20th century suffering and trying to make sense of it. So my fundamental argument is here that this holds true for Christians too, and maybe especially for Christian theologians, both convictions. The end of theodicy, including implicit theodicy, and the commitment to think suffering together with evil that causes it. Both these intellectual commitments need to be taken as points of departure for the Christian theological thinking as well. That is my thesis. So there's one outstanding, you just saw her, there's one outstanding post-Shoah Christian thinker who did just that, and some of you have known her very, very well. It's Alice Eckert. Alice Eckert unambiguously denied any redeeming quality of suffering. For Alice Eckert, attributing spiritual value to suffering immediately distracts from the evil that lies behind suffering, evil that must be confronted. And she's the one Christian voice who suggested an inverse relation between embracing suffering and remaining passive towards evil. And this is her sentence that I find quite striking. As long as we try to comfort ourselves or others with ideas about the positive effects of suffering, including a redemptive function, the less we will be inclined to reject it as the evil it is, and the less we may be inclined to fight against it. Now, Alice Eckert was also the Christian thinker who had actually read survivors' literature and testimonies and memories. She was very much aware that also survivors, Jews who had been there, Sham, often expressed their thoughts referring to traditional interpretations of suffering. So about that, she said, perhaps only the survivors, those who have already experienced the worst that can be dealt with, have the right to cling to the older answers. She encourages everybody else to listen to the voices of today's oppressed people. Along with survivors of the death camps, these victims of oppression insist that suffering does not ennoble, does not provide moral stature or spiritual depth or refined sensibility. It does not make a person superior or more authentic than a non-sufferer. These people tell us that as long as we try to comfort ourselves or others with ideas about the positive effects of suffering, including a redemptive function, the less we will be inclined to reject it as the evil it is, and the less we may be inclined to fight against it. Thinking of suffering as bearing a redemptive quality is deeply rooted in Christian texts and interpretational traditions. I know some of you are going to say that, but overlooked is the fact that the early Christian creeds of the ecumenical councils that I'm studying with students at Tel Aviv University in Hebrew translation, these texts of the ecumenical councils of Nicaea and Constantinople do not include interpretations of Jesus' suffering. The text of the ecumenical council in Nicaea from 325. No, that's the first ecumenical council and the first formulation of a Christian creed. Notes that he suffered. Here's the whole text, and here you can see he suffered. What did he say? What did they say before? Who for us men and for our salvation came down and was incarnate and was made man. He suffered. And the third day he rose again, ascended into heaven. It's almost laconically. I suppose that many of us actually think that there's more said about it in the Christian creed. So in Constantinople, they do add something to the text. They do add that he was crucified for us under Pontius, and was buried, but the word suffered stays by itself also then at the end of the 4th century. Between his being born and having died, it is the only information about Jesus' life shared in the Creed of Nicaea. And the church fathers did not have the main intention of saying something about giving information about his death. What they were interested in is that he really suffered. That was of great importance to the church fathers. It is precisely what makes him a full human being, rather than a divinized person immune to suffering. In Greek, it's the word patonta. And for the fathers, for the church fathers, that meant the discussion was whether he was patetos or apates. And patetos, what he is, because he suffered, means in English passible. Passible, that means capable of suffering. That was important to the church fathers, capable of suffering. So the early creeds mention Jesus' suffering, but do not interpret it. It is important as a fact. To deny the fact that Jesus really suffered is considered a heresy. It's a heresy important to avoid, and we can understand that from the fact that it is a heresy with a name. The name is Docetism or Docetism, meaning it only seemed as if he suffered. He did not really suffer. That is a heresy. One might translate this heresy with denial of someone's suffering. The very fact that Jesus really suffered becomes part of the Christian creed. The denial of his suffering is heresy. So no interpretation of his suffering becomes part of the creed. Alice Eckert was very much aware of her outstanding position with regard to suffering, but she was not out of touch with the foundations of Christian belief. Her refusal to think about suffering without thinking about and against the evil that causes it leads me to the philosopher Adi Ophir, whom she did not know. So I bring these very different voices together in this talk. Adi Ophir, he's at Brown University. He used to teach at Tel Aviv University, and he is now at Brown University. His path-breaking moral philosophy, The Order of Evils, with a great Hebrew title, Lashon Lara. His moral philosophy focuses on the suffering person, the harmed person. What does that look like? Ophir is not interested in meanings of suffering. He focuses on reducible and preventable suffering. The notion of preventability entails the moral commandment to try to prevent other people's suffering. Someone's suffering that can be reduced obligates us to try to reduce it. Suffering that can be prevented obligates us to prevent it. Not all suffering is equally evil. Preventability is the criterion. So this is one of his definitions. He has many. It's an amazing book. Suffering that is not prevented or relieved is an evil. So the key is to identify the suffering that can be prevented or reduced. And the preventable entails the imperative to prevent. The moral task is precisely to answer a call. That's how Adi Ophir says it. According to Adi Ophir, the only way out of this situation demanding that one respond to a call, the only way out of a situation where you are supposed to respond to a call is through indifference. Indifference, I quote, to someone who suffers superfluous evils. Again, superfluous evils are the evils that we could prevent. That's why they are superfluous. All evil is superfluous. Indifference to someone who suffers superfluous evils is the end of moral interest and of the moral matter. Indifference to superfluous suffering and loss excludes one from the moral domain. That's the worst. Indifference, in the other English word for it is apathy, apatheia. In Greek, apates, incapable of suffering, an important word for the church fathers. It is an important term in early dogmatic discourse, not in dogma. Apates, apathetic, is what Jesus is not, because that means not capable of suffering. Adi Ophir states, in any occurrence of suffering, someone is posited as the addressee of a call. In any situation of a person suffering superfluous, reducible suffering, there's someone appointed who could help to reduce the suffering. Anybody can turn into a suffering person at any certain moment in his or her life, but everybody is also a potential addressee of a suffering person's call at any time. Can we avoid the call of the other's suffering? Adi Ophir says, now you hear that Adi Ophir is not famous for his moral philosophy about suffering. He is famous for his political philosophy, and you hear the undertones of this political philosophy. To censor, to remove, to prevent access to communication channels, to communicate in a way that neutralizes the cry. All these are responses in the face of the suffering of the other, in my ring of communication. But each response can only be made once I have already been the addressee of this suffering. And very much like Alice Eckert, again, they didn't know each other. Also, Adi of Fear emphasizes the sufferer's preference for action over theory. The one who cries for help has no time to give meaning. She's interested in relief, not interpretation. So I go back to the full screen. I go back to the full screen. I also go back now to Jesus the Jew and the suffering of Jesus the Jew. Remembering Jesus as a Jew helps Christians to remember his suffering as the suffering of another. So Christians who are not Jews remember that the Jew Jesus suffered. That helps them to understand this suffering, not as the suffering that they immediately and completely identify with, but it's a suffering slightly detached. It's the suffering of another. So that is the suffering of another that with the help of Levinas and Adi of Fear, they can train to be the addressee of someone's call. A Christology less invested in redemptive suffering. Now I take Alice Eckert's proportions. A Christology less invested in redemptive suffering may engage more with taking the other's suffering seriously. The memory of the suffering Jewish Jesus as the suffering of an other can help Christians to divest from interpretations and justifications of suffering. That is Levinas and Levinas saying that the justification of the suffering of the other is the origin of all amorality. So if Christians learn to divest from interpretations and justifications of suffering and invest into hearing the call of people in need, or the memory of the suffering Jewish Jesus may help Christians to move from being Christological bystanders to becoming active addressees of a call. That's my formulation with the Christological bystanders. Not sure about it yet. So why is the early dogma important? Why do I quote the dogmatic decisions of the 4th century? It is important for a few reasons. It's important for the inner Christian dynamics of self-critique. Early dogmatic discourse is ecumenical in both senses of the word. It's ecumenical because it includes the whole world, and it's also in the 4th century. And it's also ecumenical as it still states what Orthodox, Protestant, Catholic Christians have in common, what they all share. Nobody of these mainstreams, not just the mainstream churches, it's all the Orthodox and all the Catholics and almost all the Protestants who are and continue to be committed to the formulations of the 4th century, to Nicaea and Constantinople. So early dogmatic discourse is ecumenical and continuously binding for Christians of all denominations. So it is also important for the chance of a successful Christian repair of tradition, for a Christian tikkun. In post-Shoah Christology, the question whether a certain thought tradition is inherent to Christianity or not is crucial. This has been very important in the whole discourse about supersessionism. Is supersessionism inherent to Christianity or not? Is anti-Judaism inherent to Christianity or not? So usually most of the things that have been really successfully changed in Christian discourse are those thought traditions and thought patterns that are not agreed upon that are not rooted in the ecumenical councils themselves. So this is why these statements that are formulated as statements of belief, different from all the various narratives of New Testament tradition, these statements are statements agreed to following discussion and discourse. So especially for the Greek fathers, noting that Jesus had suffered was important mainly as an anti-docetic statement, manifesting his true humanity, which is no less dogma than his divinity. That is important and very important in my book. It's apparently by the 4th century, the more contested one. So the church fathers invest in explaining Jesus Christ's full humanity. Suffering is essential to Jesus' humanity. In this suffering, the capacity to suffer, that he has actually suffered. In this early, and not a certain meaning of this suffering. In this early dogmatic discourse, then, the capacity to suffer marks the core characteristic of the human being. So in English, there you can say it in one word. Also in German, not in every language, you can say it in one word. Jesus is passible. It's not a word that is used a lot. Passible. And if you write it, the computer immediately changes it to possible. But it's passible. Pathetos in Greek. That means the capacity to feel or suffer. And in the Greek discourse, it is the opposite of apetos, apatheia, apathy. So the ability to suffer, passibility, then becomes the chiffre of true humanity in dogmatic discourse. It's not the same as Martha Nussbaum's fragility or Judith Butler's or Miri Rosmarin's vulnerability, but it might be closer to these contemporary Jewish women philosophers' thinking than expected. It is today closest, this discourse about suffering, the church fathers' discourse about suffering, is the closest contemporary discourse that connects it is the discourse about vulnerability that has become a philosophical, feminist, political discourse with Judith Butler and Mary Rosmarin and many others engaged. It is the capacity to suffer that explicates full humanity in dogmatic thought. And maybe that's what I might suggest. It is true. This is true for ethical thought too. It's especially sounds true if we go back to the Greek and understand the capacity to suffer, passibility, as the opposite of apathy, indifference. It is not the experience of suffering that makes a person more attentive to other people's suffering. Here, I generally agree with Alice Eckert, but the capacity to suffer is a precondition of being human, and maybe also a precondition for acting humanely that is, in the language of Adi Ophir, non-indifferent. The early creeds state Jesus' suffering, but do not interpret it. It is important as a fact. No redemptive quality is attributed to suffering in Nicaea or Constantinople. And to deny his suffering was a heresy with the name Docetism. So I suggest that the memory of Jesus the Jew can help Christians to remember his suffering as the suffering of another. Christians may take to heart that the denial of the other's suffering is heretical. Early Christian dogmatic discourse is closer to Levinas, Eckert, and Ophir than any of them would have dreamt. They don't have also Adi Ophir. He already knows what I'm doing to his philosophy. He doesn't mind, but he's not indifferent, I hope. Alice Eckert wouldn't have cared whether her views conformed with early church dogma, but in fact they do. So I think she might have liked the idea to proclaim not only Christ's, that not only an alleged apatheia of Christ, but also Christians' apathy, the indifference to others' suffering, would be called heresy. I think she might have enjoyed that. So this chapter about suffering is just one example in my book about how the memory of Jesus the Jew as an other that means the memory of Jesus the Jew as an other, the memory of Jesus the Jew for Christians who are not Jews, how that can revitalize contemporary Christian thought and potentially and help correct and repair Christian thought traditions. So as we started, the Jewishness of Jesus is not a critical theory in itself. In my method, it works. I work from Jesus, the memory of Jesus the Jew as an other, and then in conversation with other thinkers. And this is how I try to develop the critical potential of Jesus Jewishness as an otherness. It's not automatic, but I do think it is a helpful memory in a certain othering of Jesus for the Christian theologians. But I'm happy to discuss that with you now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barbara. And my head is spinning. I assume that's true for many, many other people too. And I just read that chapter yesterday too. So we have a number of questions here in the chat. And I think that what I will do is just choose one, and we'll get to some of the others, I hope also. So Hilmar Pabel asks, it says, crucified for us. Is that an interpretation of suffering in the Creed of Constantinople? This is term crucified for us. Can we call crucifixion a form of suffering? And do we interpret this suffering by saying that it is for us? How does that work?
Yeah, good one. I thought about that too. I mean, first of all, the amazing thing is, I think that there is a kind of a collective memory of both Christians and non-Christians that there is a suffering for us. And it's quite surprising that the main for us is actually the incarnation in the texts. That's both Nicaea and Constantinople have the what is done for us is actually the happening of Jesus' birth or the incarnation. So it the suffered is not connected to for us. This crucified for us, I have been thinking about that too. It's not. I think that in the most creeds, it's not said crucified for us. Like in the creeds that are now everybody thinking about their everybody who has a Sunday tradition of saying the creed, like in the Apostolic Creed, crucified is the crucifixion is also not as mentioned for us, but it's I think it's true. It's there. It's not the main tradition. Crucifixion is definitely different from suffering. I think there it's the important thing is to remember that it's actually also quite striking that that Pontius Pilate got into the creed, so and not the Jews, So which is a very strong anti-Jewish tradition that it's not only that the Jews, that the anti-Semitic notion of Jews having killed Jesus is not there. It's even the place is taken by explicitly by Pontius Pilate. But I think it's more to think about this crucified for us. It means that it was one of the options. It was one of the thought options. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, I'm choosing somewhat randomly among the questions here, but since you called out Keiko Dreidger Hesslein before, I'm going to take one of her questions also. She said the contemporary feminist theologians differentiate between choosing to suffer and being made to suffer. I'm curious if the early church fathers or thinkers engaged in that differentiation as well.
Yes, I'm sure they did. I'm sure they did, and I think they had also immediate experiences of suffering immediately for their confession, for their beliefs. It's many fathers also write about that. And they do also have these formulations that it's important to them that was not in vain, for example. So they themselves suffered for their beliefs, or they know closely, or they're in close proximity, temporal proximity to other Christians who have suffered for their belief. Definitely, I think here it's very important to see that for me it's very important here to go with Levinas. Levinas also doesn't say that any interpretation of suffering in the biblical and in the religious traditions are worthless. It's just that he cannot say it he cannot formulate anything like that anymore, and that I identify with. I also cannot say it anymore. And it's interesting when you think about people today who are further away culturally from the Shoah, that there might be contexts where choosing to suffer may have also positive connotations. But I found it very, very striking what Alice Eckert said, because she was in touch not only with the survivors of the Shoah. She was very engaged with various with various people thinking about oppression. Now, for myself, actually, I must say that I find it difficult. If women tell me that they choose to suffer in a certain situation, yeah, I don't really know. I actually don't support it. Again, if a woman tells me about her suffering, and interprets a certain suffering that she deals with, and it's something that at that given situation cannot be reduced, like a certain illness, that is one thing. But if she interprets her suffering like suffering under some certain violence, where I would go to I would then walk over to Adi Ophir and say, well, okay, I'm apparently here the addressee of a call, and maybe suggest distancing, and maybe try to open to open a window to get out of the situation of suffering, if that is possible, rather than reinforcing. Rather than reinforcing it. I think that it actually has changed, but it's a very interesting question whether this fundamental cut that Levinas describes here in like no more theodicy. This is somebody who does not give up tradition, and he does not give, but no more theodicy. Whether this is actually also very relevant for other cultural contexts, far from Jewish-Christian dialogue.
Let me acknowledge Let me acknowledge a couple questions that are heading in that direction. Tom Plant, during your talk, posted, I wonder about your thoughts regarding compassion fatigue when people are repeatedly confronted by suffering experiences and images. For example, confronting homelessness in big cities or the current atrocities in Ukraine. And I want to throw together with that a question from AJ Levine, who thanks you, and it says, how do we talk today about suffering, given the legacy, especially in the United States, of slavery, and in relation to 1 Peter 2:21, for to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you should follow in his steps. And that verse, she points out, is used in the context of telling enslaved people to obey their masters.
Yes. So that's two questions. Compassion fatigue with homeless. I don't know.
Or just perceiving other people's suffering. That's the
But the only thing that comes to my mind immediately is the last time I encountered somebody homeless was a few weeks ago. No, it was still cold, so it's like 2 months ago, and I walked with my little daughter, and she turned to a homeless woman and asked her if she can bring her something, and the homeless woman was a little bit irritated, and then my daughter said, she's 10, she said, something you need, and then she said she needs a blanket, it's cold. So then we went to get a blanket. But it was it was interesting, because it was not about doing a good deed. It was what do you need, and then and then hearing what is needed, delivering it, nothing additional, no overdoing, the precise thing that is needed. And so that reminded me of it was all that. The whole conversation was done by my daughter, but it reminded me of Levinas saying that his spirituality is the material need of the other. So I think compassion fatigue sometimes. So that's really what helps. The question, what do you need, and then to try to get that exactly. About slavery and slave being talked into accepting their suffering on behalf of somebody. That reminds me also of your question, Kaiko. This the women being talked in accepting suffering. I think here these Alice Eckert's voice is really these examples shows how important Alice Eckert's voice is, and so I appreciate that also in Levinas, who didn't make the point, but also in his formulation, he has suffering and its evil. So probably Christian theologians with that heavy tradition of oppression, with a very certain oppressive language of suffering, might decide about language, rules of language. Whenever I say suffering, add suffering and the evil behind it, if there is evil behind it. But check it before. But I might check it before I continue about suffering. I really do think that is very important to make this conscious shift. And then yes, suffering has always been supported with many New Testament quotes, and that is where I do something that we also talked about that in when we were in Boston, about how New Testament verses commit Christians. And I then we had this discussion at the dinner, remember, Ruth? And I said, well, there are many New Testament verses and there are different New Testament narratives. There, Christians actually do have a choice, and they can elevate certain sayings, and they can also distance themselves from other sayings. And here, the formulations of the ecumenical councils, they have a much higher authority, because they actually are decisions that follow a long discourse. So here I do find it very exciting that the apathy is a heresy. To think this idea that apathy and indifference is a heresy, and suffering as the capability of suffering, that is actually something that actually says something about human vulnerability. But vulnerability in all this political feminist discourse is far from accepting suffering. It's a form of resistance. So I think that needs a lot more to be invested in.
Thank you so much. There are several other enormously important questions that people have asked, but it is past 1 o'clock here. We are out of time. I don't know whether you want to stay on and have a conversation on the Zoom screen, and we can certainly accommodate that. But have a live conversation with people. But I want to give people who need to go and do other things permission to leave, and to close the formal part of the program with a deep thank you to you for your work in the book as a whole, which I do recommend to everyone to read if they can get their hands on it, but also for your raising these questions and opening these doors to these larger conversations, which have so many different directions they can go and are so important, and are, I believe, going to be setting the agenda for a substantial part of the dialogue for some time to come. So thank you very much. I do invite anybody who wants to stay on, unmute themselves and have direct conversation with Barbara for at least a few minutes.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Ruth.